Hey guys, today we are going to be looking at religion and reform. Basically, a reform movement is a organized effort to change society in some way. And what we see in the 1800s is that a lot of these movements to change society come from a religious movement called the Second Great Awakening. So we're going to connect those two things together today and then talk about a few important reformers. So, like I just said, a reform movement is some type of organized effort to improve some area of society. Now, the word improve, quote unquote, kind of depends on like your own interpretation of what's bad with society and how you think you should fix it. But some past examples of reform movements, like in the 1800s, would be like an effort to end slavery or increase rights for women or changing the educational system or changing the prison system or getting people to stop drinking so much. Those types of things were common reforms back in the 1800s. Today, common reform movements, you've probably heard about like immigration reform or healthcare reform or education reform or prison reform. Basically, it's just an organized effort to change those parts of society in some ways. So let's focus on the 1800s though. So like I mentioned before, a lot of these efforts to change society actually come from a Christian religious movement that is popular in the 1800s called the Second Great Awakening. It's basically a time period where people went from being already kind of religious, probably pretty religious, to becoming like super religious. It's technically a revival because people are getting reinterested in the church, but it's not really like people lost interest in the church to begin with. What we are going to see is that there is a shift within the Christian church about how to think about salvation, like going to heaven or hell. And this new idea, this new attitude towards salvation is that if you do good in life, you get to go to heaven. It's leaving behind that idea of predestination. And this is actually not really surprising for the time period because it really does reflect kind of what's going on with the Jacksonian democracy. Basically that like people have control over their own lives, even the common people. So common people, men, women, free or slave, like a lot of people did get inspired by this movement because it gave them hope and agency or power over their everyday life, and also then what would happen to them after they die. So the most famous preacher in the Second Great Awakening is a guy named Charles Finney. He led what were called Hellfire revivals across New York, and Hellfire just means that it was like super emotional. He would invoke these ideas of like hell being a fiery, burny place, and like you don't want to go to hell, you want to go to heaven. So it was really, really emotional for these people. You'd have like people passing out in the crowds and having these big like emotional connections and outbursts to what was happening in Charles Finney's sermons. And so the area that he traveled in upstate New York, that was mostly where he was, becomes known as the burned over district, you know, hellfire, fire burns, that kind of thing. The really interesting thing about these revivals is that they would be outside because there was no actual church building big enough to hold all these people that wanted to attend. They would go on for days at a time, like a whole week where these people would get together. They would literally camp out. And you can see back here the tents. And then they would attend multiple church services a day. And also, women were able to come, blacks were able to come, free and slave in southern parts of the country where this was happening. However, it was segregated along gender lines and along racial lines. There were also like black preachers and things like that that would be giving their own sermons to black congregants. But it was definitely a movement that crossed gender and crossed racial and economic lines as well. So some of the consequences that we see of the Second Great Awakening include new churches. So So I know we mentioned Mormons before really briefly, but Mormons were founded by a man named Joseph Smith. The actual church itself is known as the Church of Latter-day Saints. It still exists today, and it came out of the Second Great Awakening. It's also considered one of these utopian communities that actually survived this time period. They are going to face discrimination for multiple reasons. One is because they're incredibly economically successful, but also because they had a separate text from the Bible called the Book of Mormon. And at this time period, they did practice polygamy, which was having multiple wives. Now, if you notice here, it says until 1896. So if you meet a Mormon today, there's probably a chance that you know one. Don't make jokes about having multiple wives or stuff like that. It's not something that they do. It's a part of their past. It's definitely not modern, and it's considered offensive. But back in the day when they did practice polygamy, it was a source of discrimination for the Mormon church. And so eventually Joseph Smith is murdered, and the next successor is a man named Brigham Young, who decides to move the Mormons out west so they can live without discrimination and without persecution. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Mormon movement out west a little bit later on in a different objective. That's a new church. Another new church is called the Shakers. Again, we mentioned them as a utopian community. They found success because they made furniture. If you've ever heard of like Shaker cabinets, it's basically just like a nice white plain cabinet. But they're interesting because they ban alcohol, they ban cursing, and they banned sex. So it's really difficult to, birth new members of your church if you don't have sex. So the Shakers really had to rely on recruiting new people to come to their church instead of, growing their congregation through children. And today the Shakers still exist, but I think there's only like a handful of them left in America. So we can also see that churches in general grew dramatically. Existing Christian churches experienced big jumps in membership as well. All right, so now let's connect this to reform movements, right? These organized efforts to change society. So what we really see here is that the Second Great Awakening is preaching that it's your job, it's your responsibility to get into heaven. And the way you do that is by doing good things on earth, like bettering society. So a lot of these people who are inspired by the Second Great Awakening start to think, well, a really easy way for me to do good things is to go out in society and try to change it for the better. And so you see that the Second Great Awakening kind of sets the stage or kind of like the platform for all these reform movements to happen. So beyond this, we're going to talk about 3 areas of reform today. We'll spend a whole nother objective on women's rights, and then we'll spend a whole nother objective on abolition or the end of slavery. So right now the 3 we're going to start with. The first is going to be education reform. So at this time period, education was mostly reserved for rich people, and then among them mostly boys or their sons. And so schools, public schools, really were a joke. If you were wealthy enough to afford a private education for your child, that's what you would do. And there was this man named Horace Mann who was in Massachusetts, and he believed that education was a way to kind of bring about more equality and level the playing field among people in society, that it shouldn't just be reserved for the richest people in society. And so he created the first board of education in Massachusetts, which eventually other states are also going to adopt. He convinced the state government in Massachusetts to pass laws that increased taxpayer money going into public schools to make them less of a joke and more of a competition for private schools. And he also made attendance in school mandatory, which I know some of you guys are like, God, he's the worst. But I mean, this was really important at the time because a lot of those kids were not getting any education, but they were also working in factories or they were working on farms, and child labor was a huge problem at this point. So getting them into school was a kind of a way to get them out of child labor. Again, though, this is still mostly directed towards boys. Females do get some education opportunities, but again, mostly boys. And also this is just for white kids. This is not really something that is affecting even free Black kids in the North, and definitely not slaves in the South. So it's not fully equal, but it's a step in the right direction towards a better education system. Okay, our next area is prisons. So at this point in history in the 1800s, prisoners for all crimes were just kind of thrown together in one pot, like in one prison. And there really wasn't this focus on getting people out of prison. It was more of like a punishment for what you'd done, not really a focus on like teaching you how to be better so that when you get out, you won't do the same mistakes. And this was a huge problem, especially when a lot of these prisoners are mentally ill, and mental illness was not something that was actually really studied or known of at the time. And so there was this woman, her name was Dorothea Dix. She was a Sunday school teacher, and she would go around to prisons and teach these Sunday schools. And what she was finding is that there were so many prisoners that were sick and who were like mentally sick, but also physically sick. And she thought that there would just be a better way of housing these prisoners and getting them ready to enter the world again. And so she proposed separating mentally ill prisoners from general prisoners. And then for the mentally ill prisoners, creating like hospitals essentially that were known as asylums. And then the focus for all of these prisons and asylums would be rehabilitation, not punishment. So basically focusing on getting them ready to enter the world again and be productive members of society. And again, going back to the Second Great Awakening, this idea that, well, now they can better themselves because they have been rehabilitated and now they can go to heaven too. Over here on this side, I'm not going to read it to you, but if you want to pause it, here's some of the stuff that she witnessed when she was touring different prisons. It's probably one of the most disgusting things I've read, talking about a woman literally ripping her skin off, but that's how bad things were. And so thanks to Dorothea Dix, there were laws that were passed that try to fix the prison system. And lastly, this is my favorite lady. Her name is Carrie Nation. She's up here at the top with the hatchet that we'll talk about. But there was an effort in the 1800s and actually in the 1900s too to end alcohol consumption. This is called temperance, the banning of alcohol. And to be fair, like alcohol was a really big issue in the 1800s. It was contributing to crime. It was contributing to diseases spreading, especially STDs. It was a problem. Like people were way drunker than they needed to be all the time. And so a lot of women especially took up the cause of temperance. They would often, use biblical reasoning to back up why you shouldn't drink alcohol. And they successfully in some states got laws passed that banned alcohol. And it's not going to be there till the 1900s where you officially see the 18th Amendment, I think is the one that totally bans alcohol nationwide for a period of time, called Prohibition. That eventually is undone later. But, this is kind of where that movement starts, to try to, fix society by getting people less drunk. So Carrie Nation is the most famous person. She actually does most of her work in the 1890s, but she would go around and attack bars with a hatchet. With like you see it right there, like a little axe. She wouldn't attack people, but she would attack like liquor bottles or the bar itself or the building. And she'd be arrested for it because that's destruction of private property. But it just got her more famous, and she kind of became the face of this temperance movement to ban alcohol. So again, later on in American history, in the 20th century, you will see a nationwide ban. But for now, there was success in getting some state and local laws passed that did actually ban alcohol in some areas. So later on in a few more objectives, we'll talk about women's rights, because a lot of these women here are also active in the women's rights movement. And then we'll spend a whole other day talking about abolition as a reform movement as well.